I thought it was a simple babysitting job. I was 15, desperate for cash, and nobody thinks twice about leaving a kid with a polite-looking teenager who says she's good with kids. I learned that night how quickly an ordinary house can stop making sense. The ad had been a throwaway on a neighborhood board. Evening sitter needed, sleeps through the night. Key hidden, $40. The woman's voice on the phone was friendly, precise, like she'd done this 100 times. She said the child's name was Rose, that she'd be asleep by the time I arrived, and to go in through the side door where the key was taped under the railing. The street was a dead end. The house sat like the final thing at the end of a cul-de-sac, with a single porch light that made the pavement look like a theater stage. I remember the smell, old laundry detergent and something sweet that clung to upholstery. A child's blanket over the back of a sofa, a stack of board games with a missing piece. Everything about the house read like a lived-in life. The family photos on the walls were the ordinary kind that make a house feel safe. Birthdays, a dog with a lopsided grin, a kindergarten portrait where a tiny kid in a plaid shirt is mid-smile. There were toys in a corner, plastic dinosaurs, a faded stuffed bunny, so I told myself I was exactly where I should be. The woman, who introduced herself at the doorway as the mother, walked me through the house in a low voice. "Rose is heavy sleeper," she said. "Bedroom at the end of the hall. Just watch TV, don't go poking around. Phone's on the kitchen counter if you need it." She closed the door behind her, the sound of a bolt sliding into place. I took the living room couch. It was a lazy kind of evening, old cartoons on mute, the TV glow making a soft rectangle on the ceiling. I remember thinking how easy the job was going to be, counting the minutes on my phone and picturing the $10 bills stacking up in my head. That comfortable adolescent certainty is always dangerous. It convinced me that the world worked the way adults told me it did. Around midnight, I got up to check on Rose. The hallway was long and carpeted. It smelled like dust and baby powder. Her door was ajar, a sliver of lamplight leaking into an even darker corridor. There were crayon drawings taped to the wall, stick figures with smiling faces, rainbows in shaky arcs, but the dates on the paper were years old. The bed was made, tucked in the way a room looks when someone hasn't actually slept there in a while. A small, untouched cup on the bedside table, a layer of dust on the window ledge. I told myself I was being a worrier. Kids are notorious for leaving evidence everywhere. But there was a hollowness to the room that didn't match the living room toys. Still, a sleepy child can look unused for hours. Maybe Rose was napping afterward. Maybe I was inventing worry to spice up a dull night. And then I saw him. At the doorway to the master bedroom, a silhouette stood framed by the hallway light. He was facing me, arms loose by his sides. When he stepped forward into the doorway, I could see his face, middle-aged, a crooked smile, a missing tooth that made his grin look like a crescent moon. He didn't say anything. He didn't seem alarmed that a stranger, me, was in the house. He smiled and tilted his head, like someone who'd been interrupted from reading a book. "My brother," the woman said from behind me, as if she'd appeared out of nowhere. She introduced him briefly, with that soft blur of "he's harmless" talk that adults use when they want to stop a child from overreacting. She used the word dementia early, as if it explained everything. "He gets confused sometimes," she said, pressing her hand to his shoulder like she could keep him anchored. She told me his name, then carried on to the car and left after a quick wave. The door closed. I remember the soft thunk of it sealing the hallway into a smaller, quieter world. There was something about the way he looked at me that didn't fit any simple explanation. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even focused. He had that slow, wandering attention I'd seen on late-night shows when they explained memory problems. But his smile lingered too long, and when his eyes slid past me toward Rose's closed door, it felt like a thing with intention had shifted. He moved down the hall to the child's room and stood there, hands folded, as if he were on some quiet private watch. I went back to the couch. Every small detail started to feel wrong. The lamp in the living room hummed in a way I had never noticed in a house before. The clock on the mantel moved in mechanical certainty, each second amplified. When I stood to check the kitchen, the house felt larger somehow, like a mouth that had suddenly opened. My phone buzzed in my hand, no service, typical for that area, and that tiny modern lifeline vanished. Then the first real oddity, a quiet scuff of footsteps behind me, low and steady, the floorboards contracting under a weight I hadn't accounted for. I turned, and there he was again, standing at the end of the hallway, where seconds before the child's bedroom had been in clear view. He hadn't used the stairs, there were no stairs, but he had moved as if the house itself allowed him to shift from one shadow to another. He smiled the same crooked smile. "You okay?" he asked, voice soft as cotton. I said yes, because my throat was dry and the word felt safer than silence. Something else was missing. There were no sounds of a child, no shuffling under blankets, no small breathing, no toy clock ticking away time, no laundry basket spilling under the weight of tiny socks. The sight of photos and toys had convinced me of normalcy, but the house was missing the tiny, messy proof of recent life. The woman had told me Rose was asleep. The house suggested she hadn't been there in weeks. I tried to be practical. Maybe Rose was sleeping at a neighbor's. Maybe the mother was economical with details to keep me from worrying. Maybe dementia made people act oddly, and that explained the man's presence. Adults always offered these easy fixes, reasons that closed doors instead of opening them. At some point I decided to leave. I can't give you a clean, heroic reason why I bolted for the window and pushed through the screen. When fear tightens in the chest, decisions get sharp. My exit was instinct, a cold animal urge that chose the path of least resistance. I climbed out onto the small patch of grass, landing hard and panting under the streetlight. My hands were scraped. The porch railing had bitten my palms. My mom pulled up minutes later, the car headlights slicing through the quiet. She had the kind of single, efficient anger parents get when they see their kid in danger. Practical, mobilized. We left without looking back. As we drove away, my phone chirped. A text from an unknown number. "Where are you going?" I remember how the message looked on the screen, simple black text in a sterile white bubble, and how my stomach folded. It implied someone had watched me go. It implied someone knew my name, or at least had a way to get it. We drove straight to the police station. The officer at the desk didn't laugh, but they didn't seem alarmed the way my mother wanted them to be. The woman at the house told them, calm, incredulous, how she'd never give up her child with a complete stranger. She insisted Rose existed. She insisted her brother was harmless. I left that night with my hair sticking to my forehead and a hollow in my throat. I never learned if Rose was really Rose, if the man with the missing tooth had been alone in that house all along, or if the text came from a neighbor with a dark sense of humor. The unanswered things sat there like a map with missing pieces. If you've ever babysat for someone you barely know, you understand the tiny bargains you make. You hand over a key, they hand you the sound of a small life. Sometimes those bargains are honored. Sometimes they show you gaps you didn't even know you could fall through. A lot of people would say the man's dementia explained everything, that it made him wander and smile at strangers. I won't argue with that. Dementia is real, and it changes people in ways that scare family, and I was the one who left through a window. But I also know how adults smooth things over to keep an uneasy balance. He's harmless, they say, when they want to hold together a life that's fraying. That phrasing is what we were left with, harmless words over hollow rooms. If that story rubbed at something inside of you, stick around. I've got 4 more like it, ordinary jobs that turned into nights I still rewind in my head. If you love dark true stories, subscribe. I post tales like this every week. The second job was supposed to be a quick payday and a laugh, cleaning out vacated condos in a block that always smelled faintly of fried food and bleach. My friend Jen and I were college poor and practical. We split a list of units, bags of trash between us, a couple of cheap flashlights and a radio that mostly played static. The job paid by the unit, which made the hours race by when you counted up the dollars in your head. This building was one of those low-income developments where the walls carry history the way old trees carry rings. Every apartment had a small personal geography, an abandoned coffee cup here, a wall where something had been ripped off in anger, graffiti like initials carved in peeling paint. We worked fast, scraping years of living into trash bags. At first it was the usual: socks, yellowed mail, a lamp missing a shade. Then we found the attic hatch. It was a square cut into the ceiling near the hallway light, the kind you'd miss unless you were searching for a place something might hide. The hatch hadn't been used lately. The edges were undusted and stiff with age, but the metal latch was loose, like somebody had been up there in a hurry. We kicked the hatch a few times and it groaned open, a column of stale air breathing out. Jen shined her flashlight inside and laughed. Maybe the previous tenants had a secret. The beam caught a coat hanger and a plastic tub, the small domestic evidence of a life stashed away. We slid down a few boxes and pulled out an oven drawer that a tenant had apparently wedged into a cabinet and left like a relic. Ordinary junk, right? Then the drawer moved. We were kneeling in front of the stove when the drawer that we'd pried out 2 minutes earlier nudged itself forward with a soft mechanical click. Neither of us touched it. We stared at the empty kitchen like we'd been pulled into a trick. The radio in the corner crackled, spitting one half-formed word that could have been a name if you wanted it to be. "Jen," the static said, or maybe it was my brain rearranging noise into sense. Both of us laughed it off. We told ourselves the building settled. Old appliances make weird noises, heat expansion, anything to keep our muscles from tightening. That first oddity, the drawer, was a breadcrumb, small, explainable, and convincing enough to be dismissed, which made what came next worse. We went down into the basement to haul out a set of boxes that smelled like mildew. The stairs were thin and creaky, the kind that announce every step like a culpable witness. The basement smelled like concrete and forgotten winters. Boxes lined the walls. A lone naked bulb hung in the center, producing a small pool of yellow light and a bigger ocean of black beyond. We worked methodically at first, throwing stuff toward the stairs, dragging them out in a pile. The building's pipes did their low talk, the distant hum of someone upstairs moving furniture. Then, faint at first and then clearer, came footsteps above us, not the slow, measured tread of a human passing overhead, but the high, urgent patter of someone bounding up a flight of stairs. We looked at each other. Neither of us expected anyone in the building at that hour. The footsteps reached the landing above like a ricochet and then stopped. Silence filled the basement like a held breath. We went still. Our flashlights jittered against cardboard. The footsteps began again, this time not above, but at the interior stair that connected the basement to the apartments. They were running, fast and heavy, like they had somewhere to be and didn't have time to spare. The light from above swelled as if someone had kicked on the stairwell bulb. A shadow moved across the bottom of the stair opening. We had that moment, the one where you can imagine 1,000 resolutions, and then we slammed the heavy metal door shut and shoved the deadbolt as if a flimsy latch could hold back whatever had been there. Our heads knocked together in the dark when we shoved the door. We had bags piled between us like a makeshift barricade. We heard breathing on the other side, deliberate and measured. Something tapped the metal in a rhythm that could have been either someone checking whether the door was locked or the building settling into a tired, malevolent mood. The radio fizzled and cut out. We waited in the dark until the only sound was our own breathing and our hearts thudding against ribs. I kept thinking about that oven drawer clicking forward like a small, deliberate movement. I thought about the attic hatch and what might have been moved there in haste. The rational explanations, mice, old wiring, a prank, were doors I kept walking past because they offered no heat to make me comfortable. When we finally forced the door and ran for the stairs, we left half our supplies behind. A mop, a bucket, a bag of gloves. The lobby lights were on, the property manager fiddling with a clipboard like nothing had happened. He smiled when he saw us. Too easy, the kind of corporate smile that treats fear as an inconvenience. He wrote something on his pad and said, "There's been some complaints about squatters," in an efficient voice. We told him about the footsteps. He nodded and told us not to worry, that he'd handle it. He offered us $5 extra to finish the next unit and a bland reassurance about security cameras. We walked away without taking the money. The building's front door clicked shut like a mouth and swallowed the hallway behind us. Later, he told us the stairwell camera had been offline for months. Later, the police logged a call, "No suspicious persons found," and closed the file. The unit we'd been in was cleaned out by the manager 2 days later. No signs of anyone living there. No evidence of recent occupation beyond the usual detritus. Jen said she heard someone whisper her name once, but neither of us could agree on the exact syllable. You learn, doing jobs like that, to distrust the part of your memory that wants to make patterns out of random things. You also learn that the patterns that are real don't arrive in full explanation. They arrive as small, sharp things that make you leave a place before you should. We walked home in the rain, our clothes still dust-furred, and I thought about how quickly the night could bend. A building with a dozen apartments becomes a cavern of lives. Some lived, some left, and in that cavern, voices have a way of finding your name like a key. I kept replaying the sound of that oven drawer. I still see it. A drawer nudging forward on silent bearings, as if whatever had been packed into the apartment had shifted awake. There's a thread you can pull through those two stories. Small jobs, small pay, big unknowns. In both, adults had a way of smoothing over discomfort. He's harmless, we'll look into it, probably nothing, and we were given a shorthand to translate fear into nothingness. Maybe that's what scares me most, not what was in those houses and apartments, but how quickly ordinary people minimize things that would have made me leave sooner if I'd been listened to. The third story began as work and ended with a sound that still makes the back of my neck tighten. I'd been hired to do some work around a property. Light chores, help with groceries, tidy up a yard, for an older couple who wanted an extra hand. The pay was reasonable, and they were supposed to be down on their luck folks who needed help more than they needed questions. I showed up in the daytime, under a sky the color of dented pennies. The house sat back from the road, with a gravel driveway and a hedge that had outlived whoever had planted it. Richard was the kind of man who smiled with his whole face, except his smile was brittle in places like someone had chipped off the corners. Elaine, his wife, moved slowly, and she asked my name more times than felt normal. That part of the story matters because it's how nurses and family members often prepare you for symptoms you'll be told to ignore. "She forgets," Richard would say, passing off gaps like a familiar story. "She's sweet," he'd add, and the word felt like a bandage. The house was full of the small scratches of age, a doorframe rubbed raw by generations of hands, a hallway carpet with a clean line down the center where 2 feet had always trod, faint cigarette burns on an armchair. At night, the house seemed to keep its breath shallow. There were scratch marks near a back door, not violent, more like persistent attention, lines worn into wood where someone had leaned and looked out for a long time. At first, the oddities were the sort that age makes possible. Things misplaced, small noises, a clock that lost 15 minutes over the course of an afternoon. Richard apologized for the mess and waved it all away. He had a way of speaking that made you feel like you were interrupting his life by trying to care. The first truly frightening thing happened on a night when the wind pushed against the windows and made the trees out back knock together like a chorus. I had turned in early in the guest room. The ceiling fan hummed as if it was trying to push sleep into my bones. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a presence in the doorway, a shape there that hadn't been there when I fell asleep. At first, I thought it was Richard, maybe out for a late check on something, but the silhouette moved in a way that didn't belong to his slow, careful gait. A shadow passed across the hall. I sat up and listened. There were small, shuffling footsteps in the corridor, and then a sound right at my door, the soft scrape of fingernails on wood. When the door opened just a crack, I saw a thin silhouette and an arm, Elaine's arm, I recognized it then, holding something reflective, a glint in the night that caught the moonlight and broke it. For a heartbeat, I thought she carried a teapot or a banister ornament. Then the thing shifted, and I could see the outline of a kitchen knife, held with a slow, surprising steadiness. "You don't belong here," she whispered. Her voice was small, unreadable, like someone reading the wrong line from a poem. I froze, because the mind still wants to believe in small things. There are early moments in danger when your brain trades in the currency of denial. She's confused, she's lost, and I used every one. But the knife gleamed. Elaine's eyes were bright in the doorway, and her lips said something certain. I remember thinking that no matter what the doctor had labeled in a chart, a person with a blade and the intention to use it is a person who can act in a way you can't control by making polite requests. The house, which had seemed ordinary in daylight, had turned into a place designed to hold secrets. Richard, when he emerged into the doorway a moment later, laughed it off in a way that cut the air. He put a hand on Elaine's shoulder and said, "She's had a hard night," and then turned to me with the practiced calm of someone trying to keep a house from tipping. "Don't worry, it's fine. She doesn't mean anything." His hands shook a little. That was the first honest thing he'd said. There were scratches on the inside of my door by morning, a pattern that suggested someone had tried to get in and then changed their mind, a place where wallpaper had peeled and revealed a different color under the surface. Once again, I had the option of taking a rational path. Maybe Elaine had panicked. Maybe Richard was protecting her privacy. Maybe, as he insisted, she only meant to startle me. But the knife remained real. The memory of that shape standing at the threshold has a gravity that doesn't fit nicely into any tidy explanation. I remember crawling out of my bed and leaving through the window like I'd practiced an escape route in my head earlier that day. I didn't plan it. My body moved before my mind gave permission. There was a moment when the ground outside felt like something ordinary again, wet with dew, dark under a sliver of moon. I ran until I reached a street with a lit storefront and called 911 from a payphone because my phone had died and I wasn't thinking about charging it. The operator's voice on the other end asked me to stay where I was, and I stayed because somewhere in me, a part of me had learned that when you're young, staying is sometimes the hardest, most sensible thing to do. When the sirens came, there was a layer of yellow light over the gravel driveway and paramedics moving with professional efficiency. Elaine was taken away in a chair with soft restraining straps and a blanket. Richard stood on his porch and watched them go, small against the flood of emergency light. Later, he told the officers that Elaine had been acting strangely for weeks, that he thought it was memory-related, that he had tried to manage it himself. The officers looked at one another in the way professionals do when they don't have the words to render something simple and human into the forms they use to make things legible. I don't tell you this to frighten you without cause. I tell you because the last thing Richard said before the ambulance doors closed made my skin prickle. "I didn't want anyone to know," he admitted, the first real confession of the night. "She would get so upset if we had to put her in a home. I thought I could handle it." There is a kind of denial that's not malicious. It's a clinging to dignity, and it can make people keep dangerous things small until they are not. I left the house with more questions than answers. I had evidence, a knife, scratches on doors, a woman taken away by medics. I had the man's excuse. She forgets. It felt like a pattern by then, an older person's vulnerability turned into a quiet peril, and someone else smoothing it out so that bills got paid and reputation stayed intact. That was where I'll leave the third story for now. The house, the knife, the night the problem finally broke into the open. There are details that stay with me. The way the porch light pooled on the gravel, the sound of the ambulance doors slamming, Richard's voice softened by regret. Those images stick because they are the sharp things that wake you at odd hours. If you've been paying attention, you might notice what these stories have in common. They begin with small, plausible tasks and then gather into something bigger. They all relied on trust. Trust in a neighbor, trust in a manager, trust in someone's word, and that trust was sometimes misplaced. They also show how adults deploy explanations that keep their own lives steady while passing risk to kids who are paid in cash and told to be grateful. I'll pick this up again soon. There are 2 more nights I have to tell you about, one that happened on a late delivery run, and another that I can only label as a composite of a dozen similar stories I've heard from people who did night shifts for minimum wage. Both of them will sound familiar if you've ever worked a job where you were expected to be brave without being allowed to be afraid. The next one steps into an even smaller light. It's about being alone in a workplace at 3 a.m. and hearing a voice that calls your name when no one should be there. The next job was supposed to be boring and safe. Late-night deliveries, tips on weekends, radio low, and my hands on a warm steering wheel. I was 20 then, between semesters, working for a courier app because the hours were flexible and the pay looked okay on paper. The city at 2 in the morning is a different animal, soft and exhausted and full of corners where sound goes to sleep. You get used to the hiss of passing tires, the distant clack of a bar closing up, the smell of cigarette smoke and fryer oil lingering on a summer wind. You also get used to feeling like the only awake person who matters. That night, the app pinged me for a stack of deliveries heading toward the industrial edge of town, warehouses, strip malls, a few houses that still kept their porch lights on because the owners were anxious or forgetful. The last stop was the one that set my skin on edge in a way the rest of the night hadn't. It was an address listed as a house, but tucked behind an auto repair shop, the kind of place where the map puts a pin and your GPS shrugs. The GPS voice told me to turn onto a narrow road, the kind with no sidewalks. And as I drove, the only light was the dashboard and the red tail of a neon sign half hidden by a pine. When I pulled up, there was no car, no neat mailbox name. The porch light was off. The house looked like someone had pressed pause on living. Curtains drawn, a small stack of mail on the stairs, a child's scooter lying on its side by the garage. I should have left the package at the edge of the porch and moved on. That would have been the practical, insurance-friendly choice. But delivery drivers are paid by speed, by efficiency. You learn small shortcuts. You tell yourself the risk is statistical and manageable. I pulled up to the curb, grabbed the box, and went up the steps. The wood under my boots sighed. The door was unlocked. It was only unlocked by a fraction, enough to step through if you were light and determined. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first, lemon cleaner and something metallic, like a machine that had been oiled and left to stand. The living room light was dim. Someone had left a TV on muted, and a rectangle of blue glowed against the walls. There were signs of a life in freeze frame, a bowl of fruit gone to an unappealing sheen, a stack of magazines, a small pair of rain boots lined up by the door. I set the package down and checked my app. Delivered. A standard tap. I backed toward the door to get my phone, and that was when I heard my name. "Hey!" A child's voice called from somewhere deeper in the house. It was thin and high, like someone borrowing confidence. "Are you here?" I froze because in the world of late-night deliveries, voices inside a house when you think no one is home are not a curiosity. They are a risk factor. My brain catalogued options: kid, drunk tenant, someone hiding from someone else, and tried to pick the smallest of the possibilities. I called out, "Package!" as if that normal thing would be an answer. The footsteps were quick and light, running across linoleum into a hallway. Then a tiny hand brushed my shoulder. I looked down and saw a girl, thin, dark hair in a messy ponytail, pajamas too big on her. She looked at me with the blunt curiosity of kids who have been taught to open doors for people in the neighborhood. "Where's Mommy?" she asked. I thought relief. A kid, a simple wrong leave, a mix-up. I remembered the training we had about delivering to homes with kids. Be polite, keep a safe distance, don't get invited in. I held up my hands and said, "Hey, I'll leave the box here. Is your mom here?" She pointed down the hall with a forefinger smeared in something that might have been jam. "In the back bedroom." Her voice was small but sure. She walked ahead of me like she expected me to follow. The stupid part about fear is that it can be introduced in the most practical way. I followed because I couldn't imagine the quicker possible consequence, because I thought the right action was to be helpful. The hallway was narrow, walls a pale color stained with fingerprints, a white handprint where someone had pressed too hard. The bedroom door at the end was open a crack. I pushed it gently, and inside the room was an adult-sized bed, made cleanly with a hospital blanket folded at the foot. There was a wheelchair parked by the window, a plastic cup on the bedside table, and a framed photograph on the dresser. A woman holding a toddler with a laugh caught mid-frame. The woman in the photo looked like she could be the girl's mother. There was also no one in the bed. The cup had a crusted ring, like it had been there for a while. The girl tapped her chin and then, like an afterthought, said, "She went to the store. She told me not to open the door for anyone." A chill pressed behind my ribs. "Did she say she'd be back soon?" "Maybe," the girl said. Then she turned and walked back toward me. "Can you come back later?" Here's the point where the story bends. Adults would say, I should have called my dispatcher, left the box, kept to the rule book. Instead, I gave the girl a little of my time. I told her I would come back, tapped the app as attempted delivery, then stayed for a minute and tried to make small talk to keep her company, to figure out if she was alone or not. Kids have a way of telling you what's true without trying. She didn't cry. She wasn't obviously frightened. She just had a flat lack of expectation. It was while we stood there talking that a car pulled up outside. At first I thought, finally, the mom. The engine idled, a low hum like an insect. A man, middle-aged, collar of his jacket up, stepped out and walked around the house with a purposeful stride. I watched him move past the window. He didn't look toward the house. He looked at the street as if he were scanning for someone he didn't want. He stood by the curb for a long minute, then leaned forward and spoke to someone in the passenger seat. I couldn't make out what he said, but I got the sense he was watching the house like it was a problem. I turned back to the little girl, and she was suddenly at the doorway, small and tense. "I don't like it when the man waits," she said. The air changed. The safe arrangement, one driver doing a delivery, a kid left briefly in a house, became a geometric problem where angles opened to let danger in. I told her I needed to go. The rational voice in me that had been edited by years of safety training rose up. I told her I'd return, that I'd knock when I came back. When I stepped toward the living room, the man by the curb walked up to the porch like he owned the steps. He was at the top before I could stop him. He had a face that struck a balance between too knowing and exhausted. He smiled a small smile. "You lost?" he asked. His voice had no warmth. I said, "Delivery. She shouldn't be answering the door," he said, almost conversationally. He looked past me into the hallway, his eyes settling on the bedroom door. "Where's her mom?" I pointed toward the street because I could not answer, because even if the story had an innocent ending, it didn't feel like my place to bring a human being into it. The man stepped closer. He asked me where I was coming from, which route, where I lived. Small, harmless questions that stack like a fence until you realize it's a cage. The little girl's voice behind me said, "He can come in. He has keys." She said it casually, the way a child mentions a pet name. That was the moment 1,000 small alarms went off in my head. Keys. The man had keys. The idea of someone letting you in when you shouldn't be in was not a child's mistake. It was an adult decision. I felt like I was watching a script I hadn't been told I was in. I stepped back. "I need to go," I said. My voice was flat. He smiled as if he had expected that answer. He watched me put the box back in my trunk. When I closed the hatch, he hovered for a second and then walked away toward his car. He didn't hurry. He did not look back. I got in and sat there for too long, engine idling, hands on the wheel. The little girl watched me from the doorway as if she had offered me something and it had been refused. I thought about the possible explanations. A worried neighbor who had been watching for a break-in. A man who wanted to make sure the girl was safe before her mother returned. A husband checking on his family. I chose the option that let me move along. As I pulled away, the man started his car. For a sliver of a second, I thought he was going to follow me. He didn't. He turned the opposite direction like he was heading to the main road. I told myself all the things you'd tell yourself to not waste your day replaying what-ifs. But I still drove the longer way back to where I lived. I called a friend and told him the story in a tone that pretended to be joking. He laughed a little but asked if I wanted him to come over. I said no. That night, my app pinged me again, a delivery review from the address I'd just left. "Driver did not wait," it read. Someone had tapped the screen and written. The notation had an air of casual dismissal. A moment later, there was a new note. "Left, unattended. Customer didn't pick up package." Whoever wrote it had assumed someone would come out and collect. They assumed a lot that we do as a society, assumed that homes are homes, that people are where they're supposed to be. I later learned the address had a history of odd reports. Doorbells rung at odd hours, yard lights inexplicably left on, a neighbor who swore they saw a figure move through the curtains. None of it amounted to a police report that stuck. None of it gave me the kind of confirmation that would make a good story for someone else to go gape at. It left me with a sticky, persistent image, a child at the doorway, a man standing by the curb, keys that make people and places open. I told myself I had done the right things. I had prioritized my safety. I had documented the attempted delivery. And yet there is a tiny, persistent ache of shame that comes from leaving a child in a doorway when she begged for company. You tell yourself that you couldn't know, that the person who pulled up might have been the girl's father, that you've conflated circumstance with menace. That ambiguity between the pedestrian and the dangerous, between the plausible and the possible, is what keeps these stories alive in your head at night. I don't know if that man was dangerous. I don't know if he had keys because he belonged there, or because he came from somewhere else. I know what I felt, watched, quickened, like a line I hadn't expected to cross. The delivery was a small job that taught me the cruel lesson that being visible does not always equal being safe. You can probably see the pattern by now. Jobs that demand we move quickly and think cheaply, and in the hurry we accept a margin of risk. Sometimes the margin is irrelevant. Sometimes it is the difference between going home and not. Composite, inspired by similar real accounts. This last story is not one single night in my life. It's a collage of dozens of conversations, a stitched-together account built from what friends told me, from a message board's late-night confessions, from a co-worker's trembling words passed between coffee breaks. It's every night janitor who found a sleeping person in an office at dawn, every overnight fast food worker who discovered footprints on the counter, every security guard who heard their name called across a parking lot where no one should be. I'm labeling it composite because it doesn't pretend to be one eyewitness memory. It's a story shaped from the same pieces you've already heard: loneliness, a routine, the thin line where policy meets the unexpected. It starts on a Tuesday that felt ordinary. The job was night janitorial work at a corporate plaza, buildings with glass facades, a fountain that shivered in daylight but sat black and glassy at night. The contracts paid poorly, and the work was steady. You swept, you emptied trash, you stacked chairs, you killed the coffee machine at midnight and set it to warm for the morning staff. You became fluent in the small hum of HVAC units and the way fluorescent bulbs stuttered when they were near their end. On that night, the building felt emptier than usual. The cleaning crew moved through floors like slow ghosts. We kept to ourselves because the job didn't ask for conversation. Productivity measured in rooms emptied and minutes shaved. Around 3 in the morning, my partner's radio chirped with static, and then a voice. My name. Not my actual name, but the nickname everyone in the crew used, the one plastered to me like work clothes. Hey, it said, soft through the speaker like a secret. We shrugged it off. Radios dropped signals, old buildings bounced noises weird. But later, while I was mopping a corridor near an executive suite, I heard it again. My name called, not in the tinny nick of a radio, but clear and right behind me. The sound came from the direction of the stairwell that led to the roof. There was a muffled footstep that could have been a person or a loose tile. I walked toward it because curiosity on night shifts is a contract you sign without meaning to. The maintenance room door was locked, but the key was on a hook outside, left by some careless day worker. When I lifted the key, I felt the hairs on my arm prickle. I found a flashlight and followed the sound to the loading dock. The dock smelled of oil and damp cardboard. The gate was down but not locked. The key had been turned and someone had pushed it just enough to give a gap. Inside there were signs of life. A blanket draped over a pallet, a set of shoes tucked neatly under a pallet rack, a small stack of boxes someone had organized like a makeshift bed. There was a cheap phone by the blanket that buzzed once, and then stopped. We called the night manager. He came with a flashlight, the heavy kind that makes everything look harsh and small. He insisted that people slept in loading docks sometimes. Homeless, tired, someone who thought the night might be a safer place than the street. He said we'd call security and let them handle it. The security officer arrived and asked the man, when they found him, to leave. The man mumbled and put his jacket around himself. He had a hollow kind of politeness that said he'd learned the rules by heart, but there was a detail that cracked the simple explanation. On the way up the stairwell, we both heard what sounded like a woman's voice calling a name none of us recognized. It came from one of the empty executive offices, the kind with carpeted floors and a wall where expensive art would hang. The voice was behind a locked door. We knocked. No answer. The voice stopped. We called the security channel. The security officer looked at me and said, "Buildings in the night have their own company of noises. Don't put meaning where there's only machinery. People will tell you that explanation, that sound is the HVAC or someone on a call far away, because it is the tidy fit. But those tidy fits don't soothe the part of you that remembers the voice calling your name and the cold like metal against your spine." That night we filed a report and the record said transients removed, and the building logged the incident and turned a key on a file. The security footage, if we later asked to see it, had metaphorical gaps. A camera here, a blind angle there. The footage committee live by budgets, and footage keeps its own calendar of what it preserves. Another night, a fast food worker I knew told me how, during a graveyard shift, someone had been in the back room 3 nights in a row, quiet, moving trays, boiling a kettle, never buying anything. The crew caught him on camera the 3rd night. A thin man who moved like he was used to finding the warmth, who ate from the trash when they weren't looking, who left a pile of empty bottles like a small shrine. He always went out the side door and never stepped into the light. The manager called the police. The police suggested outreach. The man was never charged, never pursued. One day the cameras showed him step out into dawn and vanish into a street that swallowed him like a mouth. The crew never knew whether to be relieved or guilty. These composites collect the same theme. Workplaces that feel like safe bubbles by day become porous by night. The policies designed for liability, don't let anyone in, call security, lock the door, work fine until someone isn't allowed the privilege of basic daytime visibility. When the building is empty of people who can witness it, anything can feel like it has more room to be strange. The composite ends the way these stories often do, with procedures. We filed reports. We learned to lock doors differently. The janitors started carrying 2 radios instead of 1. The fast food crew switched on a motion light near the side door. Those are tidy changes. They are also small concessions that don't answer bigger questions. Who sleeps in the margins of our economy, and why do we expect night workers to be both brave and indifferent? We also learned a different lesson, the kind that moves from policy to muscle memory. Trust your instinct. If something about a space feels wrong, leave it. That was the chorus rattling through every conversation that fed into this composite. People who worked nights, who were young or underpaid or on the edges of systems, told me the same thing. Get out of the building if your gut says get out. It is practical, and it is miserable. It asks you to put your safety above the impulse to be helpful, above the fear of losing pay, above the social calculus that tells you to be brave and quiet. After these 5 stories, the babysitting at the dead end, the condo clean out with the attic hatch, the house where a knife appeared at a bedroom door, the late-night delivery with a child on the porch, and this composite of night shift encounters, there's a shape that emerges. It isn't a tidy moral, it's a pattern of vulnerability. We worked for money, for flexibility, for the chance to pay a bill or buy a textbook. The jobs were ordinary. They promised normalcy, a child asleep at home, a building emptied and swept, a couple who needed help, a list of deliveries that fit neatly into a shift. In each story, ordinary trust was the common currency. Trust that a mother would let you in and come back. Trust that a property manager would secure a building. Trust that an employer knew the limits of what they asked you to do. And in each case, adults smoothed edges instead of addressing the cracks. He's harmless. We'll look into it. Probably nothing. Those are the phrases that pressed the stories into silence. They flattened fear into a story that could be told without consequence. They left the young people, me, Jen, the delivery driver, the crew who cleaned at night, with images that replayed in the dark. I'm not telling you these things to scare you into never taking a job. That would be absurd. Young people work to survive. They take shifts because someone told them to, because they need cash, because flexibility is a kind of liberty. What I do want to say is this. The mundane can bend into menace without a single dramatic reveal. Small details do the heavy lifting, a missing dust layer on a cup, an oven drawer that nudges itself, a porch light turned off, a man's keys in his hand. Those little things add up to a sense you can feel in your bones. When I look back on all of this now, I see the same thin line cutting through. A willingness among some adults to minimize discomfort so their own world remains whole. It's understandable. People hide things from themselves to keep going, but it can cost others more than comfort. It can cost a night's sleep, or a sense of safety, or a clear answer when you ask for one. If there's a practical takeaway, it is modest. Trust the small alarms in your chest. Keep your phone charged. Let someone know where you'll be. Don't let business efficiency talk you out of common sense. And if you ever leave a job that feels strange, don't be ashamed that you left. These stories are not badges of cowardice. They are records of paying attention when other people smoothed over the noise. These nights still visit me. Sometimes it's an image, a crooked smile with a missing tooth, a drawer that clicks on its own. Sometimes it's a sound in a movie that takes me back to a hallway I ran from. They live in the ribcage muscle of memory, small and cold and capable of surprising you. But they have also taught me to listen to my instincts, to the people who tell me in small, urgent voices that something isn't right. Which of these 5 shook you the most? Do you have a job story that still wakes you up? Share it in the comments, tell it plainly, keep names vague, and help others learn where the line between ordinary and dangerous has been for you. If you want more real-life nightmares like these, subscribe, I'll post more stories, and we'll walk through them together.